Picking up in section 10, we're going to continue our micro considerations by looking at employees. When speaking with potential vendors, visiting, meeting with them, we need some good detailed information on employees. How many do they have is a good place to start. Another, what is the average tenure of the employees? How long have people been there? One big problem that many overseas vendors have is turnover. So a good indicator of the quality of a product, at least the potential for the quality of a product, is in part driven by how long people have been working at a given plant. What formal training programs are in place for those employees, whether it's customer service, production specific, something else, and equally important, demonstrated compliance by a potential vendor with national and international labor standards, work conditions, emergency exits, cleanliness, bathroom breaks, lunch areas, all things that any decent human being would be interested in, but from a business perspective are also going to impact the quality of goods coming out of a plant. One last thing to consider on this slide, total number of employees with engineering degrees, the engineers that deal with production equipment, IT people, etc. Continuing on, now moving to manufacturing and operational capabilities, questions, things we want to look into. Number of sites in the primary country that we're looking at. Does a vendor have more than one plant in the country that we're interested in? Do they have offshore sites in other countries? If they do, where are they and how many do they have? For purposes of the plant we're looking at, what's their total production capacity? How much can they make of the given types of products we're looking for in a given month? And that is related to the number of production lines that they have by category or product family, again, specific to the types of products we're interested in importing. Let's spice things up a little bit with a real-world example as it relates to evaluating potential vendors, entitled Vendors That Outsource Production. A U.S. importer of gas grills and barbecue accessories works with a number of manufacturers and suppliers in Taiwan. Located in St. Louis, Missouri, the importer targets the high end of the gas grill market and places a premium on the quality of its merchandise. Whereas accessories are sourced from a number of suppliers, the manufacture of the gas grills is outsourced to two main producers in Taiwan that have been working with the importer for many years. However, the business has grown substantially over the last 5 years, and in recent months the importer has experienced a high number of quality issues and returns of the grills. Actual customers returning grills that don't work right. Upon traveling to Taiwan to meet with the grill makers, the VP of Supply Chain observed that one of the manufacturers was at capacity in terms of its ability to produce grills. They couldn't make any more. They were at capacity. Further investigation revealed that said manufacturer was actually outsourcing production himself to another third party to make up for the capacity shortfall. Needless to say, all of the quality defects were then traced to the third party. This happens more often than U.S. importers think. We think we're working with a vendor directly, and behind the scenes, they're outsourcing production to another third party. We need to know about that, but more importantly, we need to know the capacity of the vendor in the first place. To summarize, even if an importer has a long-term relationship with a vendor, periodic checks must be made on capabilities that include current production capacity, space to expand, and the monetary wherewithal to finance capital investments. That's important for ongoing relationships. We're talking about evaluating potential vendors. Start out by focusing on things like capacity, expansion capabilities, and the financial wherewithal of a vendor to invest in growth should they need to. Consistent with that real-world example, what are the expansion plans, if any, of a given vendor? What is their manufacturing expertise by product category? What have they made historically? What are they good at? What new areas are they trying to get into? We want to know those things. What is the MP&C methodology used by a vendor? We talked about manufacturing, planning, and control a lot in our second and third module. Although we as an importer in an outsourced model don't make anything, we need to know how our vendors make things because it will impact us directly. As a part of that methodology, vendors need to demonstrate experience with detailed bills of material, something we also talked a lot about, the detailed recipes that are used to make products. We need to know the level of experience that vendors have with bombs. Hopefully this slide is familiar, and we won't be spending too much time on it, but we'll present it as a supply chain perspective related to evaluating manufacturing, planning, and control capabilities with suppliers. We place purchase orders on our overseas vendors. They have to engage in things like master production scheduling, detailed material planning. They have to combine material requirements planning with capacity planning in the plant. We're not going to do any of that. As the importer, we need to know how good our vendors are at doing that. In line with micro considerations associated with manufacturing and operational capabilities, how about the ecosystem of raw materials vendors that our potential suppliers will work with? Who do they get their raw materials from? Is it a consistent and quality supply of raw materials? We need to look beyond the actual vendor and look at our vendors' vendors. As an importer, we're also interested in working with vendors that can evidence knowledge of how they manage scopes of work and service level agreements, the detailed written agreements that vendors sign up for with the U.S. importer. And then potentially any experience a supplier has working in a CPFR model. We will recall from previous discussions that that stands for collaborative planning, forecasting, and replenishment, where we're not just placing purchase orders on suppliers, we're working with them early on in the process and sharing more information like forecasts with them. Moving along to pricing and accounting. Of course, what's the unit price by item? If we get far enough along in an evaluation of a supplier, we're going to get to the topic of cost. What's the unit price? What's the minimum order quantity? Do we have to buy a minimum of 1,000 items? Do we have to buy 10,000? If we buy 10,000 versus 1,000, what's the quantity discount on price? And naturally, the Incoterms rule, a subject we talk about a lot further down the road, but Incoterms rules, shipping terms, ex works, free carrier, cost and freight, they determine who pays the actual freight charges on both the domestic and international movement of goods. That has to be part of a pricing conversation. What will the payment terms be? 30 days credit, 60 days credit. Does a vendor require stage payments? They want 30% upfront. We've spoken of this before. Many vendors overseas require a down payment. Or might there be a letter of credit involved? What are, if any, product and country-specific customs duties in the United States on imported goods, which in turn, knowledge of impacts the landed cost of items by vendor and by the item, the product itself. All of this must be a part of the evaluation process, and much of that is impacted by specific vendor locations and activities. Technology is another micro consideration we as the U.S. importer have to be thinking about. Starting off with any enterprise resource planning software that vendors use, ERP, as we've spoken of on a number of occasions. Admittedly, many, if not most, overseas vendors, they don't have the millions of dollars necessary to invest in ERP. And that's fine. That's not a deal breaker necessarily. However, we do need to know how vendors manage their business from a software perspective. Software for materials planning, software for master production scheduling, things of that nature. Of course, we're going to place purchase orders on overseas vendors, and we need to know that vendor's methodology and supporting technology for handling the purchase orders that we place on them. Does a potential vendor have knowledge of working in cloud-based SaaS environments, software as a service, where all information is housed on the cloud and vendors need to have access to and knowledge of how to work those software solutions? And finally, on this slide, albeit an older technology, what experience does a supplier have working with electronic data interchange? The ability to communicate electronically, provide information accurately in a timely fashion, these are things that the U.S. importer needs to be looking at. Working with third parties, supply chain management, as we've said so many times, is all about working with third parties. In that vein, can a supplier demonstrate knowledge of international trade and especially logistics, the physical movement of goods internationally? Do they have banking knowledge? If a vendor requires a letter of credit or a documentary collection as payment terms, they need to have banking knowledge. Does a vendor have experience working with freight forwarders and 3PLs? A critical relationship in the supply chain is that which exists between the overseas supplier and the freight forwarder at origin that moves the goods. What experience can they demonstrate there? And depending on the nature of the product that the U.S. importer brings in, does a vendor have experience with testing labs? We've talked endlessly about toys, makeup, foodstuffs that require testing at origin. The vendors, if they sell those types of products, need experience with product testing labs. They also need experience working with third-party inspection companies. These are different than testing labs. Inspection companies come into a plant and do piece count, proper packaging, quality checks, documentation checks. Vendors have to be able to work with those types of third parties too. Naturally, not much can go on without knowledge of origin customs and other government agencies, OGAs, the ability to work with customs entities at origin in order to export from that country of origin in a compliant manner. Very important. And one that we as a U.S. importer might not think about too often until it happens, the ability to provide third parties with timely and complete commercial documents, meaning a commercial invoice and a packing list. This is the bane of international shipping, whereby vendors are producing goods, they can ship goods out, but they don't have the documents ready when the goods are ready. That happens a lot. We have to look at that as a U.S. importer. Starting to wrap up this section, last but not least, environmental considerations around the evaluation of specific suppliers. If possible, admittedly difficult to do, does a vendor measure its carbon footprint? At least a conversation about respect for the environment is well worth having. What environmental initiatives does a supplier have in place today? What are they looking at to do in the near future? We want to also evaluate a vendor's compliance with national and or international environmental best practices, one of which, there are others, but one of which is ISO 14000. The International Standards Organization provides best practices, methods for measuring and evaluating those best practices specific to environmental considerations. It's called ISO 14000. Changing up a little bit, continuous improvement and supply chain security. We want to look at that too as the U.S. importer. A great tell for evaluating vendors is to see if and what key performance indicators they use to measure their performance. Quality defects on a product run, compliance with last ship dates, complete orders. KPIs are used to measure performance. What does a particular potential vendor use to measure themselves, and how can they demonstrate that to us as the importer? Proof and results of continuous improvement programs, be they an ISO quality program, Lean Six Sigma, what are they doing and what are the results of these continuous improvement programs? Changing up a little bit, but equally important, expertise in supply chain security specific to anti-theft. If we import products that are susceptible to theft, we want to be working with vendors that have expertise in minimizing the probability of any losses. Lastly, on this slide, and similar to anti-theft, but experience with U.S. supply chain security requirements specific to anti-terrorism, Importer Security Filing 10+2, and a voluntary supply chain security program in the United States called the Customs and Trade Partnership Against Terror, more commonly known as CTPAT. In order to qualify for CTPAT, to have CTPAT approval, U.S. importers have to demonstrate a level of security with overseas vendors. That is fairly easy to measure because either a vendor is involved in CTPAT with other companies that they're already dealing with, or they're not. Conversely, if a vendor is already exporting to the United States, by definition, they have to be involved in Importer Security Filing 10+2, a topic that we'll discuss when we get to our logistics module. But for now, anti-theft, anti-terror, expertise in these areas is a good component to evaluate. Okay. That wraps up this section. When we come back, we're going to combine what we've learned in macro considerations, in micro considerations, and apply them to global sourcing and the negotiation and use of actual contracts with vendors. This is going to be a good one, so come back soon.